Okay, so what could a populist U.S. senator and a global religious leader possibly have in common? Well, on the surface, probably not much. But when you put their words right next to each other, you start to see this huge divide in how we even talk about our world. Today, we're going to explore that contrast and what it really tells us about the power of language.
So on one hand, you've got JD Vance, a U.S. senator who's known for his really sharp, mobilizing kind of rhetoric. And on the other, there's Pope Francis, the head of the Catholic Church, who champions this specific social ethic that's all rooted in the idea of human dignity. The source material here isn't trying to set up some kind of political smackdown, but rather a clash of two very, very different worldviews, and really two different ways of speaking.
So what actually happens when we put their ideas in direct conversation with one another? Well, as you're about to see, comparing them reveals this fundamental tension in how our leaders talk about some of the biggest issues we face, from immigration to the very question of who truly belongs.
All right, let's dive right in with the most detailed point of comparison, the language of migration. This is where the difference between them becomes, well, incredibly clear. It really shows how words can frame a super complex situation as either a terrifying threat or, a shared responsibility. Take this quote from JD Vance about Haitian migrants in Springfield, Ohio. He says the town has been ravaged. I mean, think about that word, ravaged. That's not a neutral description, right? It's a word that paints a very specific picture of a destructive force attacking a helpless victim.
And if you look closer at the specific language he uses, you can see how this narrative gets built piece by piece. Haitian illegal immigrants immediately brings their legal status into question. Causing chaos suggests society is breaking down. We already heard ravaged, which paints that picture of total destruction. And then framing migration as a source of disease, that introduces this element of like a biological threat. All those words together create this really powerful image of invasion and decay.
Okay, but how does that story actually stack up against what fact-checkers found? The source material points to a few key checks. PolitiFact found that actually many of the Haitians were in the country legally, and they rated that claim about diseases skyrocketing as mostly false. Then ABC News reported that local officials in Springfield called the most extreme claims totally baseless. So this context is pretty crucial for seeing the gap between the story being told and the reality on the ground.
And this is where the contrast just becomes crystal clear. While Vance's language is all about building a narrative of threat, Pope Francis offers a completely different way to think about it. He uses 4 simple verbs: welcoming, protecting, promoting, and integrating. See the difference? This isn't about security, it's a framework for social responsibility.
So where does this all come from for Francis? Well, it's all built on one single core principle. According to the source, for him, every single migrant has an inalienable dignity. This means a fundamental worth that has nothing to do with their legal status or where they're from. It's just absolute. Okay, let's pivot to our next section and see how this all connects. Because this isn't just about people coming from other countries. The language our public figures use also draws these invisible lines around who gets to be considered a full, legitimate member of the nation itself.
Here's another quote from JD Vance that got a lot of attention. Back in 2021, he called some political leaders childless cat ladies and argued they don't have a direct stake in the country's future. And the subtext there is pretty hard to miss, right? It connects having children directly to your political legitimacy.
So the source we're looking at really breaks this down. What it says is that language like this creates a kind of, a political hierarchy. It basically suggests that your investment in the nation, your civic worth, is measured by whether or not you have kids. It redefines who gets to be seen as a fully committed citizen.
So what's the counter-argument from Pope Francis's perspective? It's this idea of infinite dignity. The concept, which is laid out in official Vatican teachings, is that a person's worth is just there. It's inherent. It exists beyond every circumstance. It doesn't depend on your family or what you do for a living or your life choices. Your dignity is just yours, period.
And you can see this same kind of dynamic play out when it comes to LGBTQ+ issues. The source points out Vance using really charged terms like groomers and crazy gender theory. Now, in contrast, while the Vatican obviously has its own doctrines, the principle that Pope Francis lays out is to respect the dignity of every single person no matter their sexual orientation, and to avoid what he calls unjust discrimination. It's basically a call to separate theological beliefs from dehumanizing language. All this highly charged language we've been talking about, from ravage to groomers, it naturally leads to a really big question about the role of truth in all of this.
At what point does powerful storytelling cross the line from just being persuasive politics into something else?
Now, this next quote from Vance, which CNN reported in the context of those Springfield claims, wow, it's really something. He says, "If I have to create stories, I'm going to do it." Now, he did clarify later that he meant creating media attention, not just making up facts, but the way he phrases it points to a strategy where the story itself can become more important than, the literal truth. And on the other side of the spectrum, Pope Francis puts forward this totally different idea he calls political charity. The concept here is that politics can actually be a lofty vocation, even a form of love, but only when it's aimed at serving the common good. And the crucial part? This vision is completely bound to truth. It rejects manipulation as a political tool.
All right, for our final point of comparison, let's look at how they talk about suffering on the world stage. It's really a contrast between a posture of indifference and an ethic of solidarity.
When it comes to the war in Ukraine, Vance said this, pretty bluntly, "I don't really care what happens to Ukraine, one way or another." It's a very clear expression of disengaging from a major global conflict and all the human suffering that comes with it.
Now, it's really important to get this next part right. The source isn't arguing about foreign policy specifics here, like whether to send aid or not. The argument is about the moral posture a statement like that represents. It's a rhetoric of indifference to the suffering of people caught in a war.
And the contrast once again is stark. Pope Francis repeatedly calls war always a defeat of humanity. His focus isn't on geopolitics, but on solidarity with the actual, real victims of the conflict. The children, the elderly, the families who have to flee their homes. It's a call to see the human faces behind the big headlines.
Okay, so let's just pull this all together and recap what we've seen. When it comes to migration, it's the language of threat versus the language of dignity. For social groups, it's creating hierarchies versus affirming universal worth. For communication, it's strategic stories versus being bound to the truth. And for global conflict, it's indifference versus solidarity. I mean, the divide is pretty clear.
So, in the end, what this all boils down to, according to the source, isn't really a question of who's a better Christian or anything like that. It's a much deeper debate about the fundamental purpose of our public language. Is the main goal to mobilize one group against another by creating fear and division? Or is it to try and build up the common good by affirming that everyone has dignity?
And that really leaves us, you and me, with a big question to think about as we listen to the news and to our leaders. Does the language they're using make vulnerable people more visible as human beings? Or does it end up treating them as a threat, a burden, or maybe worst of all, just raw material for a political story? Because the answer to that question tells you everything about the kind of world they're trying to build.